The old textbooks give many yogas that include the Navamsa. However, those yogas are not Navamsa specific, meaning they're not about Navamsa specific things. They're just using the Navamsa in conjunction with the Rashi to come up with some planetary permutation that gives a particular effect. They'll use the Navamsa for determining the amount of children, the amount of wives, and so on. Now, the techniques that they use for determining the amount of children and wives, I just haven't found to be that accurate, unfortunately. I haven't found to be very accurate. So we're really not going to get into those at this time. And we're not going to get into yogas that include the Navamsa, because that would be thousands of yogas, because so many include the Navamsa. All the important yogas that include the Navamsa are in my Core Yogas book. Okay, that refer to the Navamsa, like there's Parijata Yoga that refers to the Navamsa, and several other yogas that do it, inclusively with the Rashi chart. But there's no Navamsa specific yogas. Okay. As far as wives and children, I find the Jaimini techniques work so much better, and so those are the ones I use for that type of thing. But you will see plenty of yogas involving the Navamsa that, as you specialize in certain things, say you want to specialize in anything, whether it's wealth or children or success, power, there will always be some yogas that include the Navamsa. And so you'll learn those at that point when you need to. But when it comes to using the Navamsa in a systematic way, there's no particular techniques from the old books that show any of that, okay, that are any different than any of the other techniques we're using. And since we're learning really systematic astrology now, we're not going to bring in all these extraneous yogas that really, when it comes down to, aren't going to be as important as reading the Lajitadi Avastas, knowing what house to look at, knowing how to interpret the Deva, Nri, and Rakshasa lords of the Navamsas. Okay? Some interesting things that the old books do give, though, in respect to the Navamsa are positions, the Lagna's position, the moon's position, and so on. And in fact, it's the moon's position that's emphasized in the Navamsa in the old books. There's more information given on the moon's Navamsa than the Lagna's Navamsa. Most texts give the moon's Navamsa results, but they don't give the Lagna's Navamsa results. Okay, so the moon's Navamsa is really much emphasized. Why is that? Well, because when it comes to seeing the individuality of a person, what they're like, the moon is given precedence in Vedic astrology. So the moon sign is considered more important than the Lagna sign for seeing what a person's going to be like. Okay, even in the Rashi chart. And so that idea is carried over into the Navamsa chart, where the Navamsa is, looked at, the moon's Navamsa is looked at to be the more important defining point of what a person's like than is the Navamsa Lagna. Okay? So we're going to start by talking about the moon, even though that's not first here. Okay? Most of the books give the results of the moon in each Navamsa. They will give the results of the moon in each Navamsa, and then they'll also give the results of the moon in a Navamsa aspected by a particular planet. Okay? And so that's a more broad interpretation of the moon, where we take the moon, find its Navamsa, and then look at aspects to it. And these aspects are meant to be aspects found in the Rashi chart. So basically we're saying, okay, the moon here is in Leo, and the moon's at 5 degrees Leo, which makes it Taurus Navamsa. Okay? Then the moon is, say the strongest aspect to the moon is Jupiter. Okay? So that's the strongest aspect. Saturn could aspect it too, but it's not going to be as strong probably as Jupiter's aspect. So we start with the strongest aspect to the moon, and you read it to get a feel for that person's moon. Okay? And there'll always be lots of aspects on a person's moon. You want to look at the strongest one. And that'll give you an idea of what that person's moon is like. How good are the interpretations? Well, they're decent for saying what the moon is like, but there's so much more to making a person than just this one thing, that you'll just see a glimmer of these results in there. So you might find these interesting, you might not. Personally, I don't use these myself in my practice. These details, I just don't find to be that important for me to know. They're not 100% accurate and defined because there's so many influences on a moon, on a planet, in the chart. Well, how do I like to see what a person's like? Not by these interpretations, these cookbook things, but by really reading the chart. Looking at the Navamsa yogas, looking at the chastity yogas and the capability yogas that I teach in the compatibility course. Looking at their psychology, studying their Rahu and Ketu. Those right there tell me so much more about the person. Doing the Gemini analysis of who the person is. Those things are really the jewels of what a person's like. You know, Brihat Parashara doesn't even give these cookbook results for the moon in this Navamsa and the Lagna in this sign in the Navamsa equals this. He doesn't waste his time with that. He doesn't give planetary permutations either. He doesn't say Mars in this Navamsa will do this, or Jupiter in this Navamsa will do this. He doesn't bother with that. Because those things are just too hit and miss because there's just so much stuff going on at once, okay? Now, what he gives is Lagitati Avashtas to really see what a planet's like. In this Varga, Mars is starving. What does that mean? Okay? You're supposed to come up with your own interpretation what starving Mars is. Or in this Varga, Mars is delighted. You're supposed to figure out what that means. That's doing real astrology. We're actually reading the chart and not just reading cookbook interpretations. Okay? So if you're doing real astrology, you don't need these things. But a lot of the middle dark age books, between 500 and, and onward, pretty much rely on too much of these cookbook type things. Like Saravelli, which is considered a really famous book, is mostly just this kind of stuff. This Dracana rising, this Navamsa rising, moon in Navamsa, planets in Navamsa, aspected by other planets, planets in Rashis, and all this stuff which really doesn't give you the juice that you need to really proceed with the reading. You're way better off learning Lagitati Avashtas, understanding planets, and putting two to two together and actually coming up with a true interpretation that considers a lot of variables. So, you can play with all this cookbook stuff, see what kind of results you like. Maybe someone will gravitate towards it. It's not my style of doing astrology, though, personally. But I still wanted to give them to you because they are in the old books. And we'll look these up when we look at our example charts for fun. But I wouldn't consider just looking up these interpretations being real astrology. Okay? It's just looking up a overly simplistic thing. There's always too much going on. Okay? And while you can look up the moon's Navamsa and the aspects it's receiving from other planets, like for instance, let's take a person. Where's that section? Okay, like for instance, aspects to the moon. If the moon's in the Navamsa of Mars and aspected by Mars, the native is a fierce thief who takes pleasure in murder and killing. If aspected by Venus, one who is rich in drink, wealth, and women. This is page 10. If by Mercury, a thief who keeps changing his residence. If by the Sun, a guardian who kills Dasyus. If by Jupiter, an intelligent king and rich in good qualities. And if by Saturn, an angry man attached to strife who is dragged down by many fears. Those interpretations don't leave a lot to your imagination. They don't stimulate your creative intuition. And they don't really give you usually something that's really workable. You know what I mean? Sometimes they'll be accurate, but not enough to be something where you want to make that a focal point. I like using the symbolic images of the Horas and the Drakanas, because that really gives you a good feel of the person, in my opinion. So I don't like using these that much. And you can see what they're doing there. We're seeing Moon is in a Navamsa of Mars and aspected by Mars. So there's a lot of Mars influence. The Moon's in the Navamsa of Mercury and it's aspected by Jupiter. So the moon has a Mercury-Jupiter influence. So what we really can get from that aspect section, which starts on page 10 of your handout, when the moon's in the Navamsa of a planet, aspected by a planet, is that the moon is going to take on the nature of the Navamsa Lord and the planets aspecting it. Makes sense, right? We know that already. If the moon is aspected by Jupiter, they're going to have, a sweet moon. If it's aspected by Saturn, they're going to have a very serious moon, for instance. If it's aspected by Mars, they're going to have a fiery and quick moon. Whatever. If it's aspected by Mercury, they'll have a curious and mentally active moon. So we already know that. But also what we're learning here is that the Navamsa Lord of the moon also is going to color the moon a lot. That's all they're saying here. So we want to do this based on principle. And remember that the Navamsa is important as the Rashi. The moon sign has a lot to say for how a person is in the Rashi chart. Therefore, the moon sign has a lot to say what a person's like in the Navamsa chart too. So look at the moon sign in the Rashi and Navamsa to see how they're like. So in Western astrology, we might say, oh, he's got sun in Aries, he's like this. And in Vedic astrology, we go, his moon is in Aries. That's his Janma Rashi. His birth Rashi is the Rashi of the moon. Then he's an Aries personality because his moon's in Aries. And that works better than saying, oh, they're a sun in Aries. Okay? Now we're going the next step and saying, oh, but that moon in Aries is in Cancer Navamsa. And so now we've got an Aries Cancer moon. And then we go one step further and say, and the strongest influence for the moon is the conjunction of Saturn, but there's also an aspect of Jupiter. So see, we're just seeing what planets are influencing the moon, basically, and the signs, to get an interpretation of that moon. So if we want to study the moon, we need to study the moon in the Rashi chart, and in the moon, in what Navamsa it's in, and take the aspects and conjunctions to it. Now we got a flavor of what that person's lunar nature is like, meaning what this individual jiva is like, what that egocentric self is like. And by egocentric, I don't mean egocentric in a negative way, but as an independent, individualized being, what that individualized being is like. Moon sign in the Rashi, moon sign in the Navamsa, and the planets influencing that moon. And there you have it. So we're learning here not to, by them giving us all those interpretations about the moon and different Navamsas and so on, we're not meant to really, we really don't need to memorize all that or even resort to it. We just have to understand, what are we doing here? And that's what we're doing. We're examining the quality of the moon or the nature of the moon by looking at its influences to it and its Rashi and Navamsa signs, okay? And the moon is really important, is the most important planet to examine, because it's the moon that shows our conditioned consciousness, what we're comfortable with. And that's a really, really important thing, because it's what we're comfortable with that determines what we allow into our lives. Now how people say, oh, I could just never go there, or I could never do that, or I could never have that. Or, yeah, a lot of people like the desert, but I could never be there. Another person goes, oh, I love the desert. So it's what we're comfortable with, okay? And that's our conditioned consciousness that's developed in our early upbringing. We get used to and we adapt to our environment. That's what the moon does. The moon represents an evolution of adapting to our environment. All this would be better in a moon class than a Navamsa class, but we're getting it taught under Navamsa. So we adapt to that environment, and then we become the creature that we are. And we only adapt in the early life. After that, we don't adapt at the same rate, okay? So the influences on the moon at birth show what we're like this lifetime as a result of our adaptation of countless lifetimes. This is what we're like. This is what we're comfortable with. And that determines what we let into our lives. Okay, if a person has Saturn aspecting the moon, they're not going to be comfortable with Jupiterian things. Okay? It'll make them feel uncomfortable, even if it's an enviable thing that a lot of people would want. I also talk about this concept a lot in the compatibility course, where we look at women's chart and we talk about how in the women's chart the moon is so important for showing how much love she can receive. Any more love than that, and she's just no longer comfortable with it, at that point she'll find a way to sabotage the relationship. So that we all do that in our lives through our moons, okay? What our moon shows what we're comfortable with and what we let into our lives. Other things we will go away from. And so that's really why the moon is the most important thing, because it just shows the conditioned individual that we are, the type of individual we are, what we're comfortable with, and what we let into our space, and what is us and what is not. And to look at the moon thoroughly, the three important things are the Rashi sign, the Navamsa sign, and the planets conjuncting and aspecting it. Okay? So use what you know about the planets and the signs to understand those moons more so than these interpretations. When we look at some example charts in the next video, we're going to read these interpretations, and then we're going to logically just go about doing it based on actually understanding the planets and the signs. And then we can see what interpretation's better, the cookbook or the one of practicing that idea, but with our full knowledge. And you'll see that one's going to give a lot more flavor and color. So that's how you want to use these. That's how you want to use that moon's Navamsa. Okay? Now, they also give results of just one book that I found that even had it. The Lagna's Navamsa is usually not included in most textbooks. They just talk about the moon's Navamsa. Horasara is a textbook written by the son of Varaha Mihira. And Horasara is kind of an interesting book because it has lots of things that aren't found in other books. Some of them work well. Some of them just don't seem to work. You know, it's like he was trying to write a unique book for sure. His father pretty much copied Yavana Jataka and other texts and condensed them. Then other authors like Saravelli came along and took Brihat Jataka, Horasara's father's text, and Yavana Jataka, and wrote his own book based on those. And Prithvi Yasas, who's a son of Varaha Mihira, and Prithvi Yasas wrote Horasara, he was obviously trying to write a unique book that had things that weren't found anywhere else. And so it's a worthwhile read. Some of the things work, some of the things don't really work. Okay? One of the things he has that I haven't seen anywhere else, I have no idea where he got it from, or if he made it up, or where he heard it, because I haven't seen anything like this in any other text. He gives the results of the Lagna's Navamsas. So for instance, the native, this is on page 3, the native whose Lagna falls in Aries will be mischievous, mean, will be weak-sided, not peaceful, bilious in temperament, and sensuously disposed. Birth in Aries Amsha will confirm malefic results or disease in the 12th, 25th, 50th, or 65th year of age. So he's actually coming up with a way to see what ages can be troublesome to the person, your bad years, based on the Lagna falling in a particular Navamsa. Okay? I have not found that those ages are necessarily bad. Okay? But if a person's running an affliction, bad dasha during that time, and having bad things happen in their chart, if it falls at one of the ages mentioned, it does seem to take it down a peg and even make it worse. So you have to use those ages judiciously. And see, just try them on your own chart and you'll get a feel for those. They don't work perfectly. It's not like you can rely on this and say, oh, you're Cancer Navamsa and you're 22, so you had a terrible year. Maybe, maybe not. Okay? Unfortunately, it's not that easy. But it's interesting. You don't find it anywhere else. We'll look at that in the example charts a little bit. But don't rely on that like it's gold, because it's not. It's not as good as studying a chart, applying Lajitadya Avashtas. When it comes down to astrology, you need what's in Jaimini Sutras. Jaimini Sutras has stuff that you just can't find anywhere else, and important stuff that you need. You need Jaimini Sutras. Then you need what's in Brihat Parashara. You need Lajitadya Avashtas, you need Shadbala, you need the female horoscopy parts, you need the Dasha chapters, you need the yogas, the Nabas yogas, and the other named yogas. You need all those things in there. Okay? Anything else might help you supplement what you find in Jaimini and Parashara, but you could live without it. While you can't live without the things in Jaimini Sutras and Brihat Parashara. Okay? You can sometimes find the stuff that's in Parashara and other texts, but never as thoroughly. Okay? So you need those two texts, and you need to understand those. Anything else, you only are going to need it if you want to specialize in a particular area and you want a few more yogas or another technique to confirm things with. But you really don't need it. It's just if you want to, you can get it. Okay? So there's just billions of astrological things out there. It's just none of them work as good and are as crucial for finding what you really need about a chart as what you find in those two texts. Other than compatibility, of course, and Muhurta stuff, which you need to find in Muhurta books. Okay? So that's slightly different, though. Alright, so you can play around with this Lagnas Navamsas. Then there's one other interpretive type things the old books give about the Navamsas, and that's Grahas and Navamsas according to Yavana Jatika. Okay? And this is just a planet in the Navamsha of another planet. So Mars in the Navamsha of Mars, Mars in the Navamsha of Venus, Mars in the Navamsha of Mercury, and so on. Mars in the Navamsha of Sun, Mars in the Navamsha of Jupiter. Let's read Venus's Navamshas, because that's the most important planet, right, in the Navamsha. Venus in its own Navamsha produces a rich man having many women who enjoys various foods and drinks. Basically, a person with a strong Venus. In the Navamsha of Mars, the husband of a corrupted wife. So this means their wife will be sexually really strong, which is true. Venus in the Navamsha of Mars makes for stronger sexuality. Venus is the wife, so she's considered to have a stronger sexuality. But what this little cookbook doesn't say is that any time anyone has Venus in the Navamsha of Mars, it tends to make them more strongly sexual. But then they blame it on the wife. But that's really not fair. It's the native himself will really tend to be more passionate when Venus is in the Navamsha of Mars. Or Mars in the Navamsha of Venus will do the same thing. In the Navamsha of Mercury, a wise man addicted to sexual intercourse and singing. Okay, Mercury gives intelligence to Venus, but Mercury is really curious, and Venus-Mercury combinations can often bring in a lot of sexuality. And they're often together in the chart, too. In the Navamsha of Moon, one who indulges a lot in sexual intercourse and has a noble body. Okay? Well, when Venus is in the Navamsha of the Moon, it's starved, or it's thirsty, right? So it's definitely going to be sexually thirsty. We know that. And so it does have this issue. And we've seen also in other videos that Venus-Moon conjunctions or oppositions tend to create unhappiness in relationships and lack of fulfillment. In the Navamsha of the Sun, a terrifying Nayaka. So a really strong, overbearing person with a great and powerful mind, basically. So, these results are somewhat accurate and useful, but they're basically just relating the Navamsha as if it's like a planetary conjunction. What would Venus be like if it's conjunct Mars? It'll give a strong sexuality. What is Venus like if it conjuncts Mercury? It creates a lot of curiosity sexually, especially if the combination falls in the 7th, 10th, or 8th. Okay? What's Venus like when it's conjunct the Sun? A terrifying Nayaka, a strong-minded person who's terrible, who's not diplomatic. That's what it's like. Sun-Venus conjunction people are not diplomatic, not graceful. They usually tend to be harder and really strong, but still very relating. So they were telling people what to do, but often in not the most diplomatic ways. So these can all just be qualities. These are just similar of that planet influencing this. So rather than memorizing or looking up these cookbook interpretations, which you can do, you want to first understand what's going on here. Well, what's going on is the sign, the ruler of the sign that a planet's in the Navamsha has a strong influence on that planet. So if Venus is in the Navamsha of the Sun, it means the Sun has a strong influence on Venus. Okay? If Mercury is in the Navamsha of the Moon has a strong influence on Mercury. Now, what does it say about Mercury in the Navamsa of the moon? In the Navamsa of the moon, a poet intent on righteousness. Okay. Well, we also know that Mercury and the sign of the moon will be thirsty, logitati-wise. Now, Mercury is not going to be that productive. And now, all of a sudden, Mercury is a poet. Mercury, who's supposed to speak congruently, becomes an emotional poet. So that's not really saying a nice thing about Mercury. Okay? It's not the greatest planetary position. Mercury needs to be clear, not speak in riddles and poems, in a more evasive way, which he'll tend to do when he's associated with the moon or conjunct the moon. Okay? Because the moon ruins Mercury. All right. So keep in mind the concept of what's going on in those cookbook interpretations. They're fun to look up, but we want to remember what's happening. And that is that the planetary lord of Navamsas and the sign of the Navamsas influences the things it's in, just like it does in the Rashi chart, in a way that it colors all aspects of a person's life. Just like if you've got your moon in Capricorn, you're a Capricorn person in general, okay, with everything in life. Well, if your moon's in Capricorn in the Navamsa, you're also going to have a strong Capricorn quality in all areas of life, okay, because it marks your character, this Navamsa. Rashi and Navamsa are important for just letting us see how a person is and where they're going in life and what they're like. And that's all these sutras are telling us. So we will use these a little bit in the examples. We'll look up some things for fun, but also we'll interpret it based on our knowledge of planets and signs and take the concepts of what these ancient authors are trying to do and use our own knowledge to come up with interpretations that are going to be more valid than a lot of these sort of outdated things. But sometimes if you're stuck, you got, interpretive block, it helps to, read some of these cheesy interpretations just to get your gears moving and then try to apply that to the person's existence. Okay, so they can be helpful at times. But I wouldn't recommend memorizing all these sutras and interpretations and trying to read a computer trying to read a chart based on those memories. You want to understand what's happening, apply that understanding with a greater understanding of planets and signs and bhavas to actually read the chart. Okay.